On Thursday the 14th of June, 1962, a few minutes before 7 p.m, Juris Slazers drove up and parked outside 77 Gainsborough Street, which was a red-bricked house in an attractive tree-lined road in the Back Bay area of Boston. He got out of his car, went up to the 3rd floor and knocked on the door of apartment 3F where his mother, Anna Slazers, lived. There was no reply. He knocked again, more loudly this time. She loved music. Perhaps she had the radio or the hi-fi on too loud and couldn't hear him. There was still no answer. Juris knocked again, puzzled. She was, after all, expecting him. By 7:30, Juris was convinced that something must be wrong. Perhaps she'd been taken ill and collapsed inside, unable to call for help. At 7:45, Juris broke down the door of the apartment. As he entered, he almost fell against the chair placed in the middle of the hallway. He went into the bedroom and found that the dresser drawers had been left open. Finding no sign of his mother, Juris strode down the hallway towards the kitchen and bathroom. It was there that he found his mother, lying on her back on the kitchen floor. Her legs seemed to have been forced wide apart, with her right leg bent at the knee. Her housecoat had been left open at the front, so that she was naked from the shoulders down. The blue cord of her housecoat had been knotted tightly around her neck and tied into a clumsily shaped bow. In a state of shock, seeing that his mother was likely dead, Juris immediately phoned the police. Just 4 minutes later, they would arrive. A few minutes after that, just after 8 o'clock, Special Officer James Mellon and Sergeant John O'Driscoll from the Homicide Division arrived. A visibly shaken Juris explained how he thought his mother must have been depressed and committed suicide, but Inspector Mellon's impression as he glanced around the room was quite different. The bath close to the body was 1/3 full of water, as if Mrs. Slazer had been about to have a bath. This and other clues pointed to the much more likely explanation that she'd been interrupted by an assailant who had murdered her. There was something else too. Mellon had been struck by the general neatness of the hall and living room, yet a waste paper basket had been left in a kitchen with odds and ends strewn around it. The drawers of the dressing table in the bedroom had all been pulled open and their contents disturbed. Mellon's suspicions were soon to be confirmed. The autopsy revealed that Anna Slazers had suffered head injuries either from a fall or a blow, but had undoubtedly been strangled. Anna Slazers was just 55 at the time of her death. She was born and brought up in Latvia, where she gained a degree in agronomy. She was married with 2 children. She divorced in the late 1930s and then fled her native country when it was annexed by the USSR as a consequence of the August 1939 Nazi-Soviet pact, which carved up Eastern Europe. Eventually, in 1950, she and her children found their way to the USA. Her daughter, Maya, had married in 1960 and moved to Maryland. Anna then lived with her son, Juris, until the beginning of June 1962, when she moved to an apartment in a converted townhouse in Gainsborough Street. She led a quiet, respectable life, working as a seamstress. Her social life, such as it was, revolved around the Latvian Lutheran church and her love of classical music. The apartment was just a short walk from the symphony hall. Although there was no evidence of rape, it was clear that she had been sexually assaulted. By now, the general consensus of the police was that an intruder had broken into the apartment intent on robbery. He came across Mrs. Slazers undressing for her bath and was seized by an uncontrollable urge to assault her. He would then panic and strangle her for fear of being identified. There were, however, 2 things that puzzled them. The first was the method of entry into the apartment. There were no signs of a break-in, which led to the obvious conclusion that Mrs. Slazers must have let her assailant in. But she was a shy, retiring woman who had never been seen in the company of a man. It seemed even less likely that she would open the door to a stranger, particularly while wearing a bathrobe and without her dentures. The second question that troubled the police was motive. The ransacking of the apartment had suggested burglary, yet a small gold watch and other pieces of jewellery had been left on the side. Even more curiously, there had seemed to be some method in the disarray, suggesting a leisurely examination of the victim's possessions rather than a frenzied random ransacking. Few of the details of the crime were made public, although over the next few days more than 60 people were questioned to no avail. Indeed, it seemed for a short time that Anna Slazer's murder might be just one more Boston crime statistic. Then, on the 30th of June, just 2 weeks later, the body of another elderly woman, 68-year-old Nina Nichols, was found in almost identical circumstances. She had been strangled with 2 of her own nylon stockings, and her housecoat and slip had just been pulled up to the waist, and she lay naked and exposed. As in the Slazers' case, the apartment superficially bore all the signs of a ransacking. Nina Nichols' bags had been torn open and their contents thrown about. Her clothes and other possessions had been tossed in all directions, and a photo album had been ripped apart, its pages scattered everywhere. But again, robbery could not be considered a motive. An expensive camera worth at least $300 had been left, and the same orderliness existed in the midst of the chaos. There was no sign of a forced entry, and no clues in the character of the victim. A widow for many years, Nina Nichols was known to have no male companions. Like Anna Slazer's, Nina Nichols had a keen interest in music. She enjoyed a lively social life, visiting friends and relatives in the greater Boston area. The Boston police were now faced with a situation in which 2 elderly women had been sexually molested and strangled within 2 weeks of one another. Police Commissioner Edward McNamara, newly appointed to supervise the Boston police force, called a conference of department heads for Monday the 2nd of July. But even before the conference had ended, he received news of a 3rd strangling. Helen Blake, a retired practical nurse, 65 years of age, was found in her apartment at 73 Newshall Street in Lynn, a town several miles north of Boston. She was discovered in much the same circumstances as the first 2 victims, almost naked, and strangled with a nylon stocking with a bra looped through it. The bra straps had been knotted under her chin in the form of a large bow. Like Anna Slazer's and Nina Nichols, she had been sexually assaulted, though not raped, and her apartment had been searched and its contents left disturbed. Helen Blake had been dead for a few days by the time she was found. The autopsy revealed that she had been murdered on the 30th of June, the same day as Nina Nichols, although the time of death had been unspecified. The killer had now struck twice in the same day. Helen Blake was a 65-year-old retired nurse of modest means. She'd been married once, briefly, but the marriage had been annulled in 1927. Since that time, she'd lived quietly, sharing her life with a small circle of female friends. She was an accomplished pianist and a keen concert-goer. The pattern and frequency of the killings was now becoming too strong to be ignored, and the police began to realize that they were not dealing with isolated killings carried out by separate people. They were now forced to admit that the murders could well be the work of one person, a serial killer with abnormal sexual tendencies. Feelings were perhaps best summed up by McNamara's comments on the hearing of Helen Blake's death. "My God, we've got a madman on the loose." The news of Helen Blake's death brought a swift reaction from McNamara, as the Boston police were mobilized into the greatest manhunt the city had ever known. All leave was cancelled and every available detective drafted to the case. The 18 to 40 age group had been singled out by the psychiatrists assisting the police. The killer was, in their own opinion, a youngish man who was suffering from delusions of persecution and hatred of his mother, hence his attacks on older women. Checks were made on all known sex offenders and men released from mental institutions. As suspects were rounded up and police records were checked, the police appealed to women to keep their doors locked and to be especially vigilant. A 24-hour emergency hotline was published in all newspapers and mentioned in every radio and television news broadcast. McNamara appealed to the press, requesting that they reveal as few details about the murders as possible. The fear of panic in the streets was uppermost in his mind. Meanwhile, he sought help from every quarter. 50 hand-picked detectives were chosen to attend a special seminar given by a specialist in the sex crimes from the FBI. Among those 50 hand-picked detectives were Lieutenant Edward Sherry, Lieutenant John Donovan, Chief of Boston's Homicide Division James Mellon, and Detective Phil Dentale. All of these would later form the backbone of the police investigations into the case. Immediately after the lecture, they were reassigned to the stranglings, in the hope that their newfound knowledge would point them in the direction of as yet unrecognized clues. More than a month passed with no reports of similar killings. Then, on the 21st of August, Ida Erger, a quiet, retiring woman of 75, was found strangled in her locked apartment at 7 Grove Street, a 5-storied apartment house in Boston's West End. She had been dead for about 2 days. The crime bore all the hallmarks of the previous killings, with one grim variation. The victim had been left with her legs apart, a pillow had been placed under her buttocks, and her ankles locked into position between the vertical rungs of the backs of 2 chairs. In short, the body had been left in what one journalist described as a grotesque parody of the obstetrical position. There was one other appalling detail. In what could only be described as a mocking act of defiance, the body had been placed so that it would be the first sight to greet whoever entered the room, in this case the 13-year-old son of the building's caretaker. These details were not made public, partly because they were considered too shocking to print, but also because the police wanted certain facts to be known only to them and the killer. That way, they hoped they might catch the killer out through a blunder in a conversation, a slip of the tongue, perhaps revealing a detail that only the guilty man would know. 3 days after Ida Erger was found, the Boston Herald, in a well-intentioned attempt to calm the city, published an editorial on the statistical unlikelihood of becoming a victim of the Mad Strangler, as sensationalist newspapers now called him. Entitled "Hysteria Solves Nothing," the article read, "If it may be fairly said, the police are looking for a needle in a haystack. It may be said with equal validity that a given person's chances of becoming a victim of the killer or killers are almost nil." 6 days later, on the 30th of August, in what seemed a cruel mockery of this piece, Jane Sullivan, a 67-year-old nurse who lived alone, was found strangled in her first-floor apartment at 435 Columbia Road, Dorchester, the other side of Boston from Ida Erger. The time of her death was estimated about 10 days earlier, the 20th of August, which meant that she and Ida Erger had been strangled within the same 24-hour period. The police redoubled their efforts. A tactical patrol force was set up, consisting of 50 hand-picked men, all of them specially trained in karate, quick-draw shooting, and laboratory procedures. In 3 main units, they would comb the city by night, ready to handle any situation that could not be dealt with by any ordinary patrol cars. In early September, Dr. Richard Ford, chairman of the Department of Legal Medicine at Harvard University, gathered together state and Boston law enforcement officials, medical examiners and psychiatrists to try and put together a profile of the killer. The possibility that a woman might have committed the murders had been ruled out at a very early stage because of the enormous strength required to move the victims. For most of the psychiatrists, the mental picture that seemed to be emerging was of a nondescript man, possibly with a routine 9-to-5 job, whose safety lay in his very anonymity. A man who externally at least seemed quiet and well-adjusted, but in reality was just the opposite. What Ford and his associates were looking for, he explained later, was a common denominator, to be found perhaps in how and when these women met their deaths, or in something about the places in which they lived, or in something relating to their mode of living. Any hopes of finding a clue to the killer's identity in the pattern of the crimes was to be dashed, however, by the next group of murders, which broke the mold of the previous killings. The first of these was Sophie Clark, on the 5th of December 1962. Although she was killed in the same way as the other victims and her apartment had been ransacked, the difference in the crimes was striking. Unlike the other victims, Clark was young, just 20 years old. She was also black and did not live alone, and unlike the other victims, she had been raped. Clark's murder was followed on the 31st of December by that of Patricia Bassett, a 23-year-old secretary, on the 6th of May 1963 by the death of Beverly Sammons, a 23-year-old student from Cambridge, who, although strangled, was believed to have died from stab wounds to her throat. Both women had been raped. The police were now completely baffled. The change in the age group of the victims seemed to irrevocably rule out the psychiatrist's earlier suggestions of a mother-hating psychotic. It now seemed possible that the theory that more than one person was involved might after all be correct. The task laid before the police now seemed to be more impossible than ever. As the public outcry increased and people demanded investigation into the seeming police ineptitude, McNamara helplessly cited statistics. The police had checked over 5,000 Massachusetts sex offenders, screened every inmate at the Center for Treatment of Sexually Dangerous Persons at Bridgewater State Hospital, interviewed thousands of persons, and questioned over 400 suspects. Yet the fact remained there had now been 8 stranglings and not a single conclusive clue had been found by a force of nearly 2,600 men working 12 and 14-hour days. No woman in Boston, whether young or old, living alone or in company, could be considered safe. 2 more strangling victims were to be found that year. Evelyn Corbin, aged 58, on the 8th of September 1963, and Joan Graff on the 23rd of November. This last date was one of particular significance in American history. On the 22nd of November 1963, President John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas, Texas. The next day was one of national mourning. That the murder had been committed when the nation, and Boston in particular, was in mourning was later to be described by one psychiatrist as the greatest act of megalomania in the history of modern crime. The 11th and final strangling, on the 4th of January 1964, was to prove a final turning point in the case. The victim, Mary Sullivan, aged 19 at the time, was the youngest to date, and the details of her murder was the worst of all. In the words of the police stenographer, she was found propped up on her bed, buttocks on her pillow, back against the headboard, head on her right shoulder, knees up, eyes closed, viscous liquid dripping from mouth to right breast, breasts and lower extremities exposed, broomstick handled inserted into her vagina, and seminal stains on the blanket. Tied around her neck were a stocking and 2 brightly coloured scarves knotted in a huge bow under her chin. Between the toes of her left foot had been placed the brightly coloured New Year's card, reading, "Happy New Year." At the same time, police found a tiny sliver of tin foil, like that used to wrap film, suggesting that the strangler might have photographed her before leaving the apartment. Boston's sense of outrage at the crime was overwhelming. The youth of the victim and the awfulness of the crime, details of which had filtered through to the public, somehow struck a chord that none of the other murders had approached. New measures now became imperative. 2 weeks later, Attorney General Edward W. Brooke, Jr. announced that the Attorney General's Office of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, the highest law enforcement agency of the state, was taking over the investigation of all the stranglings in and out of Boston. He was appointing Assistant Attorney General John S. Bottomley to take charge of the operation. "This is an abnormal and unusual case, and it demands abnormal and unusual procedures," he declared. John Bottomley sat in his office at the State House, Beacon Hill. He surveyed the monumental task before him. It had been made quite clear on his appointment that this was not to be a takeover from the police, but rather a coordinating operation. Nevertheless, it was evident that the situation he had inherited was one of total chaos and confusion. In the 18 months since the stranglings had begun, 5 separate police departments and 3 district attorneys had become involved. The scattered location of the various departments had inevitably led to difficulties in communication. To add to the confusion, the different police departments had kept some details of the crimes from the public, and some from each other, either to minimize the risk of leaks or out of misplaced sense of competition. What was needed, Bottomley realized, was a central clearinghouse of information. All the data from every police department in Boston, Cambridge, Lynn, Lawrence and Salem, where the crimes had been committed, had to be assembled in one place, then somehow analyzed. Bottomley acted quickly. Copies were ordered to be made of every report on the stranglings in the files of every police department where the crimes had been committed, a staggering 37,500 pages in total. The information was processed and fed into a computer. At the end of January 1964 came the most extraordinary development in the case to date. Some weeks before, a retired businessman had suggested that Bottomley, with the help of the businessman's own private funds, enlist the help of Peter Herkos, a 52-year-old Dutch psychic. The bizarre chapter that followed would have been worthy of the most fantastic fiction stories. On the 29th of January, Herkos and his bodyguard Jim Crane arrived at Lexington, 15 miles from Boston itself. The next day, in a small motel room, the psychic began to construct an image of the strangler. First, he said, he would like to get an impression of the strangler's victims. Detective Julian Soshnik handed over a batch of photographs and laid them face down in neat piles on the bed. Herkus gently touched them, and within minutes his hand came down on one stack. This one. This top one. Show the dead woman's legs apart. I see her, he said, in his very Dutch accent. Here, I show you. He then lay on the carpet and demonstrated exactly how the victim in question had been arranged by the Strangler. When Soshnik turned the photograph up, it was of the Strangler's first victim, Anna Slazers, found in exactly the same position that Herkus had just demonstrated. Herkus would then go on to repeat the process with the other victims. Herkus's radar brain, as he liked to call it, then started generating images of the killer himself. Soon, he was describing a slight man, 5'7", weighing around 130 to 140 pounds, with a sharp nose and a scar on his left arm. There was also something wrong with his thumb. Then, inexplicably, came the comment, "He loves shoes." Later that night, Herkus drew a pencil line on a local map around an area in the suburb of Newton which contained Boston College and St. John's Seminary, and claimed that this is where the killer had lived. As the party sat open-mouthed, he cried, "I see a priest. No, he's not a priest. He's a doctor from hospital." The next morning, Herkus and his retinue drove to Boston to discuss matters with Bottomley. As the car passed along Commonwealth Avenue, and number 1940 in particular, Herkus became increasingly agitated. Terrible, awful, terrible things happened here. This was in fact where Nina Nichols, the third victim, had been killed. During his sleep that night, Herkus talked aloud. He began with a series of statements in Portuguese, a language that was alien to him. He started talking about someone called Sophia. Sophie Clark was the 9th victim, and her father was Portuguese, a fact that Herkus could not have possibly known. Then, abruptly, the psychic broke into two voices that began an argument with each other. Herkus in his normal Dutch accent, and Herkus playing the killer in a soft, high-pitched, effeminate Boston accent. A week before Herkus arrived, a former student at Boston College had written a strange letter to its school of nursing. The man claimed to be a professional writer, interested in writing an article on the school's graduate class of 1950. He also expressed an interest in meeting nurses, suggesting that friendship might lead to the altar. In view of Herkus' revelations, Bottomley now ordered a check on the man who it emerged had been on the Strangler's suspect list. It transpired he had a history of mental illness, was about 5'7" tall, weighed 130 pounds, and had a very sharp nose. He had once attended a St. John's Seminary and was a door-to-door salesman of ladies' shoes. On physical examination, the shoe salesman was found to have a scar on his left arm and a deformed thumb. Herkus had been right in every detail, but the investigation came to nothing. The salesman clearly had no knowledge of the crimes and could not be connected with any of the victims. Herkus left Boston on the 5th of February, a week after he had arrived. His involvement in the case was to end as strangely as it had begun. On the 8th of February, in what was seen by many as a police attempt to discredit the Attorney General, he was arrested on a charge of impersonating an FBI agent. Meanwhile, all efforts on the investigation were redoubled. The reward for the Strangler was increased from $5,000 to $10,000 of strangling. In addition, more members were to be recruited to the Medical Psychiatric Committee, which had been appointed at the beginning of the year. On the 29th of April, nearly 4 months after the Mary Sullivan strangling, the committee met with the representatives from the police. The major question they had been asked to consider was whether the same person who had killed the earlier, older victims had also killed the younger women. In short, one murderer or two. The general consensus amongst most was that the older women had been killed by one man and the younger by another, and that this other had tried to make their crimes resemble the stranglings of the older women. The younger victims' killers were, they felt, to be found among the girls' friends, probably unstable members of the homosexual community. This was now seeming more and more likely. Homosexual killings might well explain the degrading positions the women had been left in, as a final mockery to them, perhaps from a woman-hater. In addition, many of the victims had had connections with homosexuals in some way. The Back Bay area, in which Sophie Clark and Patricia Bissett lived, and Beacon Hill, where Mary Sullivan lived, were both frequented by homosexuals, and Evelyn Corbin's apartment house was not far from such an area. By the end of the year, the frustration amongst the police force was almost unimaginable. For many, the hunt for the Strangler had acquired the status of a personal crusade. Anxious not to overlook any possibilities, they had doggedly pursued every lead that came their way. It was amid this backdrop of low morale, dashed hopes, false trails and unmutterable frustrations that Detective Lieutenant Donovan received a phone call on Thursday the 4th of March 1965. The caller was Lee Bailey, a brilliant young attorney who had recently made his name in Boston. Now he was claiming to know someone with information about the Strangler. Bailey could not yet reveal his informant, but asked Donovan to give him some questions to ask the man to check that he was telling the truth. The man's name was Albert DeSalvo. Albert DeSalvo was born on the 3rd of September 1931, the third of 6 children of Frank DeSalvo, a plumber and labourer, and his wife Charlotte, the daughter of an officer of the Boston Fire Department. Frank DeSalvo was an alcoholic who beat both his wife and children. When Albert was just 7, he looked on as his father knocked his mother's teeth out, then one by one bent her fingers back until they snapped. Perhaps the most harrowing experience of Albert's early life, so much so that he was never able to talk about it in any detail, was being sold into slavery. His father handed him and his 2 sisters over to a farmer in Maine for a total of $9, where they remained captives for many months. The family were always poor. The elder DeSalvo did little to support them, and they were on and off the welfare rolls for the whole of their childhoods. When he wasn't brutalizing his children, Frank DeSalvo was teaching them to steal. Albert was just 5 when his father first took him to a store and showed him what to take and how to do it. Albert would progress from shoplifting to robbery and then to breaking and entering. Sex was a constant presence in the overcrowded apartment building in Chelsea, a working-class suburb of Boston where Albert grew up. His father regularly brought prostitutes back and made his children watch as he had sex with them. Albert would have his first sexual experience, with other children, when he was just 6 or 7. His usual appetite and capacity for sex brought him many early conquests among neighbouring girls, as well as the local homosexual community who were willing to pay him for his services. Frank DeSalvo left home in 1939 and made no further efforts to support his family. Charlotte would finally divorce him in 1944, marrying again a year later. Throughout his childhood, Albert would run away to escape his father's violence. He slept beneath wooden wharves of East Boston's docks, a favouring haunt of the city's young runaways. A few weeks after leaving school in 1948, Albert enlisted in the army. DeSalvo enlisted in the army on the 16th of September 1948 and went overseas in 1949. He was posted to join the Army of Occupation in Germany for 5 years. Whilst in Germany, DeSalvo discovered an aptitude for boxing and became the middleweight champion of the army in Europe. Off-duty, he continued his sexual adventuring. He made notes of officers who spent lots of time in bars, then, reasoning that their wives were lonely and frustrating, offered his services to them. This would all change when he married Irmgard, and he devoted himself to her. It was she who suggested he leave the army, and he did so to please her. Although court-martialed in 1950 for refusing to obey an order, he had a generally good record. As at school, he made himself agreeable to authority figures, remembering that they had the sharpest uniforms and best-kept vehicles. "I made Colonel's orderly 27 times," he would later say. In Frankfurt, he met and married Irmgard, the daughter of a middle-class Catholic family. He brought his wife back with him to the USA in 1954. He was then posted to Fort Dix, where his daughter Judy was born in 1955. Judy was born with a deformed hip. Albert felt that somehow Irmgard blamed him for this. At the age of 2, Judy was fitted with a cast, which DeSalvo decorated with loose, floppy bows. In 1956, DeSalvo would leave the army with an honourable discharge. A charge of sexual misconduct against the 9-year-old girl that had been laid against him was not proceeded with, and he returned to Chelsea. In his marriage, DeSalvo always sought to be the opposite of his drunken, bullying father. Temperate in all but his sexual habits, he was always happy to spend time at home with his wife and children. He was meek and dutiful with Irmgard, referring to her as his social superior, and always proud of her background as a member of the moral, Catholic, middle-class German family. Sexually, they were less compatible. Albert's relentless sex drive finally disgusted Irmgard, and she began to reject him, especially after the birth of their daughter Judy. He began to look elsewhere for satisfaction, beginning his career as the measuring man. He'd got the idea for the measuring man one night in the late 1950s. He'd watched an episode of the Bod Cummings show on TV, where a photographer auditioned would-be models by taking their measurements. This impressed him as a good way to get close to young women, so he began to haunt the student areas of Boston, looking for apartments shared by young women. He would talk his way in by posing as a representative for a model agency. Sometimes his flattery and charm allowed him to seduce women. Other times he just took their measurements, clothed or naked, promising that a female executive would come to sign them up. He never assaulted them, and the only complaints the police received came when the follow-up visits did not happen. Later, he and Irmgard set up home in Malden, a Boston suburb where their son Michael was then born. Although he had a job and a home, Albert occasionally found himself with no money and returned to his old ways, breaking and entering. He was twice arrested in 1958, and each time was given a suspended sentence. DeSalvo was again arrested in 1961 after acting suspiciously in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He was charged with attempted breaking and entering in addition to lewd and lascivious behaviour. He would spend 11 months in prison and was released in 1962. In early November 1964, DeSalvo was arrested for the sexual assaults of a number of women in Massachusetts and Connecticut. The assaults were known as the Green Man crimes because DeSalvo always wore green work clothes. It's estimated that over the course of 9 months, DeSalvo carried out a series of sexual assaults, somewhere in the region of 300 in total, in a wide area spanning Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Hampshire and Rhode Island. In his Green Man persona, DeSalvo would break into women's apartments, slipping the locks with strips of polythene that he'd cut from household detergent bottles. Once inside, he would tie the women to their beds at knife point, sexually abuse them and sometimes rape them, although he would often apologise and leave before doing so. One of the victims, a 20-year-old woman from Cambridge, identified him from police files as the measuring man. DeSalvo was arrested on the 6th of November 1964. He was sent to Bridgewater State Hospital for observation, then on the 10th of December returned to jail in Cambridge. Whilst there, he showed disturbing behaviours and suicidal tendencies, and was recommitted to Bridgewater as mentally ill in February of 1965. It was at Bridgewater that DeSalvo began to confess to the stranglings. At some point in February 1965, an unusual encounter would take place between two inmates at Bridgewater State Hospital. One of the men involved was George Nasser, a 33-year-old violent criminal who was under observation pending trial for a particularly brutal murder. The other was Albert DeSalvo, a mild-mannered 34-year-old petty criminal, known mainly for his bragging and sexual boastings. DeSalvo was boasting to Nasser of his arrests over the sexual assaults of a number of women in Massachusetts. He told him of how the assaults were known as the Green Man crimes because of the green trousers that he had always worn. Suddenly, DeSalvo would break off from his sexual boastings to ask Nasser a tantalizing question. "George, what would happen if a guy was set up for robbing one bank, but there are actually 13 banks he'd robbed?" Nasser replied dismissively and DeSalvo walked away. A few days later, he would approach Nasser again, saying, "You thought that was a nutty question? Well." The exact details of the conversation that followed are not known, but they were enough to convince Nasser that DeSalvo was the Strangler. Swayed by this conviction, and no doubt the inducement of a $110,000 reward, he contacted his lawyer, Lee Bailey. Although initially reluctant to get involved, Bailey was persuaded by Nasser's insistence that DeSalvo wanted to see him and agreed to a meeting. On the 4th of March, unsure of what to expect, Bailey went to Bridgewater to meet DeSalvo for the first time. The man who greeted him was around 5'8" tall, and dark hair, a sharp beak-like nose. His voice was thin and high-pitched, and his manner sincere and charming. His engaging style, combined with an otherwise totally forgettable appearance, made him in Bailey's opinion a likely suspect for the stranglings. It was not difficult to understand how this man might have talked his way into women's apartments, murdered them, then slipped away in total anonymity. In the recorded interview that followed, DeSalvo confessed not only to the 11 known murders by the Strangler, but also to an additional 2 killings the police had not known about. Mary Brown, beaten and stabbed in her Lawrence apartment on the 9th of May 1963, and an 80-year-old woman who had apparently died of a heart attack in his arms. DeSalvo stated he could not remember her name or the date of the murder. Later investigations would reveal that it was Mary Mullen, who was killed on 28th of June 1962. In a calm, almost matter-of-fact voice, DeSalvo gave detailed descriptions of the crimes, including facts that had never been made public. He was able to, for example, state correctly that Patricia Bissett's door opened inwards. He drew exact sketches of the 13 apartments where the crimes had taken place. He also talked about the Strangler's knot, explaining that it was in fact not a knot, but a bow that he had liked to tie on the removable cast that was on his daughter Judy's crippled hip. He liked to tie the bow because it made her smile. With the exception of 1 or 2 mistakes, DeSalvo's description of the crimes were almost faultless. Bailey, certain that he had found the Strangler, telephoned Lieutenant Donovan and invited him to come and listen to the recordings. As soon as he heard the tapes, Donovan immediately contacted the Attorney General's office. The investigators were in a dilemma. Despite the accuracy of DeSalvo's accounts and his obvious anxiety to confess, there was no real legal evidence to convict him. The Strangler left no fingerprints that could be matched up to DeSalvo's, nor had there been any eyewitnesses. The only survivor of his attacks, a German waitress, proved unable to identify him, and none of the victim's neighbors recognized him from photographs. In the absence of any evidence, DeSalvo's guilt would have to be proved. Up until then, his confessions had been made on a purely informal basis, and no one had ever been sure whether or not he was telling the truth. It was now decided that DeSalvo should undergo a proper interrogation by Bottomley on all 13 murders, with the assurance that nothing he had said would be used against him in court. Police officials and detectives in each suburb checked every statement he made. If he was found to have been telling the truth and ruled competent to stand trial, psychiatrists would examine him to determine his state of mind when committing the murders. If found sane, he would make a formal confession to be used in court, where he would plead not guilty in the hope of being committed to a mental institution. If he was ruled sane, which would mean execution, there would be no confession and all proceedings against him would stop. His immunity assured, DeSalvo agreed. Through the spring, summer and autumn of 1965, DeSalvo met with Bottomley weekly in the presence of a third party as a witness. He poured out his stories of the killings, eager to confess, it seemed in the hope that this would help him understand himself. Painstakingly, he tried to record each strangle in detail. Most of the murders occurred at weekends, he explained, because I could always get out of the house Saturday by telling my wife I had to go to work. Once out of the house, DeSalvo described how he would drive around aimlessly in his car, a 1954 green Chevrolet coupe, until what he described as the urge to murder came over him. There was no plan to his actions at all. He would pick a building at random and ring any buzzer with a woman's name on it. He found no difficulty in talking his way into the apartments with the excuse of having to do building or decorating work. After a few minutes' conversation, DeSalvo explained how he would be seized by an irrational and irrepressible urge to murder, which seemed to come over him when the victim turned her back on him. He described this in detail in the case of Nina Nichols. As her back was turned to me and I saw the back of her head, I was all hot. Everything built up inside of me. Before you knew it, I had my arms around her, and that was it. One recurring theme in the confessions was DeSalvo's total mystification of his own behaviour. There was nothing about Anna's lasers to interest any man. Why did I do it? When asked why he had ransacked the apartments, he couldn't give an answer. That's what I'm trying to find out myself, he said. He was similarly confused as to why he had left Ida Erger with her legs through the chair slats. I just did it, he said. In many of his descriptions, DeSalvo would distance himself totally, as if talking about someone else. A typical example of this was his account of how he had nearly murdered a girl before Anna's lasers. I looked in a mirror in the bedroom and there was me strangling somebody. I fell on my knees and crossed myself and I prayed, "Oh God, what am I doing? I'm a married man. I'm the father of 2 children. Oh God, please help me." It was like it wasn't me. It was like it was someone else. When talking about Patricia Bissett, the only victim to have been found covered up and not exposed, he explained, "She was so different. I didn't want to see her like that. Naked. She talked to me like a man. She treated me like a man. I remember I covered her up all the way." Similar regrets were also expressed about the youngest of the victims, Mary Sullivan. Why? I say to myself. It could have been my daughter too. At times, DeSalvo showed a marked reluctance to even discuss the crimes. At other times, he was totally calm and unmoved, as in the description of his actions after Joan Graff's murder. "I had supper, washed up, played with the kids until about 8 o'clock, put them to bed, sat down and watched TV." As DeSalvo's confidence and trust in Bottomley grew, he admitted that there had been a problem for some time. "This thing building up inside of me. All the time, I knew it was getting out of control," he explained. He explained that he'd only decided to confess on reading a statement by Governor Peabody that the Strangler would not be executed but sent to a mental institution for treatment. DeSalvo's extraordinary confessions came to an end on the 29th of September 1965. Police investigations had revealed that time and time again he had been right and had known things that had never been made public. They now had little option but to believe that the tearful man before them was indeed the Boston Strangler. As they surveyed their files, the ironies of the case must have been apparent to them. After the massive manhunt they had conducted, the killer had finally turned out to be someone who had been on their files all along, but had been missed because of the listings under the category of break-in and entering rather than sex offences. Lee Bailey found DeSalvo's case a tremendous challenge. He did not want him freed, neither did he want him to get the electric chair, but rather be placed in a mental hospital where doctors could study him and help him. In his opinion, a trial would be the only way of establishing judicially that DeSalvo was the Strangler. It was only if this happened, he believed, that DeSalvo would receive proper medical attention and analysis. He was, however, faced with a legal difficulty. Psychiatrists had now ruled that DeSalvo was insane when he had committed the murders, but under new Supreme Court rulings, not helped by the fact that Bottomley had now resigned, the prosecution was no longer willing to allow DeSalvo to confess, pleading insanity. In a brilliant legal move, Lee Bailey decided to allow DeSalvo to stand trial for the Green Man offences. Psychiatrists could then testify to his insanity without this bearing any direct relation to the crime he was being tried for. He could still be found legally insane without being executed. The case was almost unprecedented in legal history. The onus would be on the defence to prove guilt. As Bailey himself was later to say, "We found ourselves before a really unbelievable situation. It was up to us to prove he was the right man, and to do it without giving the state one single piece of legal evidence." On the 30th of June 1966, Albert DeSalvo attended a hearing at the Middlesex County Courthouse, East Cambridge, to assess his competency to stand trial for the Green Man crimes. Only by standing trial and being found not guilty by insanity, Bailey believed, would DeSalvo eventually get the medical help he needed. The charges in question here, however, were armed robbery and indecent assault. The stranglings could be referred to implicitly, but would have no bearing on the case. After the testimony from the psychiatrists, whose opinion on DeSalvo's competencies were divided, DeSalvo himself took the stand. Asked by Bailey if he wanted further psychiatric help, DeSalvo replied, "What I always asked for was medical help, and I haven't received any." Later questioned by the prosecuting counsel, Donald Conn, Assistant District Attorney of Middlesex County, he stressed his wish to tell the truth about his past, no matter what. "I feel that I couldn't live with myself. I wish to, in my own way, release everything that is inside me, the truth. And whatever may be the consequences, I will accept because I have always from the very beginning wanted to tell the truth." On the 10th of July, the presiding judge Horace Cahill judged DeSalvo to be competent to stand trial. The following day, he was brought before Judge George Ponte in the same courthouse where he had pleaded not guilty. He was remanded without bail to Bridgewater for trial as the Green Man at a later date to be agreed. 6 months later, on the 9th of January 1967, the Green Man trial opened in the Middlesex County Superior Court. DeSalvo was charged with 10 counts of indecent assault and armed robbery. His plea was not guilty by virtue of insanity. As in the pre-trial hearings, the prosecutor was Donald Conn. His main witnesses were 4 women who had been victims of the Green Man. Their identities were kept secret because of the intimate nature of the evidence involved. Reluctantly and with great embarrassment, the women told the court that the Green Man had done to them, describing how they had been tied up, raped and humiliated at knife point. Bailey's main witnesses for the defense were 2 psychiatrists, Dr. Robert Ross Mazer of Boston and James Brussel. Although DeSalvo was being tried for only the Green Man offences, it was their task to bring up the stranglings as part of his psychiatric background. Bailey's whole case hinged on the 2 psychiatrists' diagnosis of DeSalvo as a schizophrenic. In his opinion, the jury, when told about the stranglings, could not fail to judge DeSalvo insane, even though these crimes were not directly a part of the trial. Summing up the case for the prosecution, Donald Conn described DeSalvo as little more than a cunning criminal who was feigning symptoms of mental illness in the hope of being committed to a medical institution, with the hope that he would be released within a few years. In a highly charged speech, he pointed at the jury, shouting, "It's my duty to my wife, to your wife, to every woman who might conceivably be a victim of this man, to stamp his conduct for what it is, vicious criminal conduct. Don't let this man con you right out of your shoes." Bailey's closing remarks would be equally impassioned as he made a plea that DeSalvo be found insane so that he could be remitted to a mental hospital and receive proper psychiatric treatment. Not only for his own sake, Bailey pointed out, but also to achieve a better understanding of such crimes for the future. "This man," he said, "is a phenomenon. A unique opportunity for study. We've never had such a specimen in captivity. He should be the subject of a research grant from the Ford Foundation or a similar institution." "What I'm stating here is not a defense," Bailey continued. "It's a sociological imperative. Aside from the moral, religious, ethical, or other objections to capital punishment, to execute DeSalvo is just as wasteful, barbaric, and ignorant an act as burning the witches of Salem." In his summing up, Judge Cornelius Moynihan explained to the jury that they could find DeSalvo guilty, or not guilty by reason of insanity. Judge Moynihan also told the jurors that they should erase all accounts of the stranglings from their minds with the remark, "He is not on trial for homicide." On the 18th of January, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They were out for 3 hours and 45 minutes. At 6 p.m. they returned a verdict of guilty. When the jury's verdict was read out, Judge Moynihan considered carefully the question of sentencing. Bailey explained that it was DeSalvo's wish that he be incarcerated for life, saying, "He wants society to be protected from him." DeSalvo would indeed be sentenced to life imprisonment and was sent back to Bridgewater Hospital, pending permanent assignment to a maximum security prison. To Lee Bailey, James Brussel and many others interested in the case, the decision was a severe mistake. Despite its name, Bridgewater was in reality more like a prison than a hospital, and with its inadequate staffing, there was little likelihood that DeSalvo would receive the attention that he deserved. On the 27th of May 1967, DeSalvo, along with 2 other inmates, would slip away from the hospital grounds. At the time, Bridgewater wasn't a maximum security prison, and supervision was relatively loose. The escape caused a massive manhunt across Massachusetts. DeSalvo was considered dangerous and authorities mobilized quickly. As far as DeSalvo was concerned, there was no doubt that his escape from Bridgewater Hospital was a cry for help. He'd left a note on his bed in his cell apologizing for his escape and saying that he had left because he wanted help and nothing was being done for him. Psychiatrist James Brussels, for one, was convinced that DeSalvo was telling the truth. In his opinion, DeSalvo was simply and honestly bewildered by his own nature and he wanted help. His escape was a way of calling public attention to his plight. Despite hysteria among the press and public, DeSalvo would give himself up voluntarily 38 hours after escape. He simply walked into a clothing store, 40 miles away, and telephoned Bailey's office with the alleged remark, "It's over, take me back." In an impromptu press conference after his arrest, DeSalvo explained his reason for the escape. "I didn't bother anybody, and I never will. I didn't mean no harm to nobody. I did it to bring back to the attention of the public that a man who has a mental illness and hires a lawyer and no one does anything about it." In a tragic mishandling of the case, Albert DeSalvo was immediately transferred from Bridgewater State Hospital to Massachusetts maximum security Walpole prison. From there was no possibility of escape, and that was where he would spend the rest of his days. 6 years later, the story of the Boston Strangler was to end as mysteriously as it had begun. On the 25th of November 1973, Albert DeSalvo was found dead in his cell at Walpole Prison. He had been stabbed 6 times through the heart, supposedly in a prison brawl. His killer has never been found.